Well, welcome to episode 257 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and this time I'm going to talk about Chet Baker's release from 1959 on Riverside Records, Chet, the Lyrical Trumpet of Chet Baker. And this is not an original 1959 pressing. It is, in fact, a 2013 original Jazz Classics release, which I would actually say you should avoid. Some people think this is from a digital source. I think they're probably right. There's a couple of little glitchy microseconds which sound a bit like there's a digital error. And also the sound is just okay, a lot of surface noise, so again, I'd avoid it. Chet Baker was a remarkably talented musician who won downbeat polls for both his trumpet playing and for his singing in the 1950s. But he was also somebody who famously struggled with the heroin habit, and in the latter half of his life that led to a series of arrests, imprisonments, poor health, and a number of bad career decisions. While he enjoyed a career resurgence in the 1970s and 1980s, overall his greatest contribution pretty much inarguably comes in the 1950s. He recorded extensively for his whole life, though not always wisely because some of those decisions at times were driven by his habit. When he emerges on the scene, it's with Jerry Mulligan. He makes a number of great records with Mulligan, and then he emerges as a solo artist in his own right, releasing a string of good to great records on Pacific Jazz. Then, in the latter part of the decade, he establishes some ties to Europe, where he'd eventually settle when the heat from the law in the States became too much. This is made just before he's jailed for the last time in the States in the 50s, which prompts his departure. It's an interesting record, if imperfect. It's got this really interesting front line of Pepper Adams on baritone sax and Herbie Mann on alto flute joining Baker. There's no singing from Baker here, just trumpet. And when he's on the horn, he's all feel. This is not about pyrotechnics. There's no sheets of sound here. There's no bursts of notes. It's breathy, it's airy, it's spacious. Chet Baker was born in December 1929 in Yale, Oklahoma. He was actually christened Chesney. He's nicknamed Chet by his mom. He was born into a musical family. His dad was a professional guitarist. His mom played piano. When the Depression comes along, his dad has to quit music and get a regular job, and eventually in 1940, the family moves out to California, to Glendale. Chet's first taste of music is singing in the church choir, where he exhibits lots of talent, but he also has interest in playing instruments. Initially, the trombone, because he was a big fan of Jack Teagarden. His dad buys him a trombone when he's 14, but the thing is just too unwieldy for a scrawny teenager, so he ends up switching to the trumpet, where he develops an almost instant affinity for the instrument and apparently just progressed week by week by week. At age 16 in 1946, he joins the Army and he gets posted to Berlin, gets a lot of experience playing in military bands. He leaves the Army in 1948 to pursue music studies at El Camino College in Los Angeles, but he drops out after a while, re-enlists in the Army, ends up getting posted in San Francisco, which in turn has the beneficial effect of exposing him to the vibrant jazz scene in that city. In 1951, he leaves the Army for good. He moves to LA. He starts playing in the West Coast club scene. His playing at this point has progressed, and it's now, in a very timely way, very much like that of Miles Davis, not like the beboppers. Instead, it was open, spacious, minimalist, very much the style which would quickly become known as cool jazz. As such, his playing was distinctive and impressive, and he quickly begins to move in more rarefied circles. It's not long before he's playing with Stan Getz as a sideman, and he also gets the chance to play with Charlie Parker in early 1953 when Parker comes out to the West Coast for a tour. But his big break was actually joining forces with another player who'd been associated with Miles Davis in the Cool School, Jerry Mulligan, who had formed a quartet in 1952, and Baker joins on trumpet. Those two horn players carved out a niche for themselves, not by comping along behind each other or by playing in unison, but by playing together and somewhat anticipating in kind of a ancient art of weaving kind of way the next move the other player was going to make. In particular, they had a big hit with the standard My Funny Valentine, which became a signature tune for Baker. Things are looking pretty rosy at this point. Baker wins the first of a number of polls that he would top for downbeat in that decade. Then it all comes crashing to a halt because Mulligan is busted in early 1953. He gets sent away for 6 months, and Baker ends up having to go solo. However, rather than finding himself in the sidelines again, he actually hits the ground running because he's got a degree of profile. He's got a good pipeline to some of the better sidemen playing on the West Coast jazz scene, people like the drummer Shelly Manne. He starts to put out records for Pacific Jazz, and they start to sell really well. He also adds singing to his repertoire in 1954 by releasing the excellent record Chet Baker Sings. His singing voice is disarming, it's kind of unguarded, very straightforward, simple and yet not. And it does, I think, as much to define the male jazz vocal style in the post-war decades as Sinatra does. So his career is really going great guns. And when Mulligan finally gets out of jail 6 months later, he tries to call up Chet and get the band back together, literally. And Chet says, "I'd love to, Jerry, but I'm actually making too much money on my own." He releases something like 8 records for Pacific Jazz in this period. Most of them are pretty darn good. He also makes a movie in 1955 called Hell's Horizon, in which Hollywood was unable to pair his good looks with an equally good script. He then takes his group to tour in Europe. He ends up recording for Barclay, and some of those tracks end up getting released on a compilation with the amazing title Chet Baker in Europe, a jazz tour of the NATO countries. I guess NATO was still kind of fresh and exciting at that point in its existence. When he gets back from Europe on that tour, that's when Baker starts to use heroin, despite the fact that his drummer on the tour, a guy called Dick Twardzik, had died of an overdose while on the trip. That same year in 1956, he formed a quintet which also featured the saxophonist Phil Urso and the piano player Bobby Timmons. He toured Europe again that year, but then back in the States in 57-58, he's getting more and more hassle from the cops regarding his drug use. He makes this record in the winter of 1958-59, but then he gets busted, does 4 months in Rikers, and when he comes out, figures that's enough, I gotta get out of here, gonna go back to Europe where the heat will be off. Now, it doesn't quite work out that way, but that's another story. This record is made in 2 sessions on December 30th, 1958 and January 19th, 1959 at Reeves Sound Studios in Manhattan, and the producer is Orrin Keepnews, who of course was also the owner of the label Riverside Records. It's a record on which 6 of the 9 tracks are made by a sextet, which includes Chet Baker on trumpet, Pepper Adams on baritone sax, Herbie Mann on alto flute, and then a trio of erstwhile Miles Davis sidemen, Bill Evans on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, and Philly Joe Jones on drums, and occasionally Connie Kay of the Modern Jazz Quartet subs in for Philly Joe. On 2 more tracks, this reduces to a quartet, with Baker, Chambers, and Kay joined by Kenny Burrell playing guitar. One final track is also a quartet lineup, with Baker on trumpet, backed up by the Miles Davis sidemen, Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones. Side 1 starts with Alone Together, which is a ballad like so many of the tracks in this record. What you get, as you so often get on here, is Baker's beautiful, creamy vibrato contrasted with Pepper Adams' rather raw baritone sax sound, and then the interestingly deep sounds of the alto flute, played of course by Herbie Mann. How High the Mood is next. This has the same great trio up front, and this is also the first time we get to hear Bill Evans' distinctive playing. It Never Entered My Mind is the first of 2 tracks played by that quartet with Kenny Burrell on guitar. The obvious comparison here is with Miles Davis's treatment of this track, which is magnificent and haunting, and frankly I prefer, but this is a pretty good version. The final track on side 1 is another ballad, "'Tis Autumn," and the key piece is Baker's sensuous solo. I think Pepper Adams gets about 8 bars, but this is basically a Baker showpiece. Side 2 starts with "If You Could See Me Now," which is very much more of the same, more of that amazing slow vibrato that Baker can produce. Then we have "September Song," which is a second of the quartet formats with Burrell. This is actually very disappointingly produced because Burrell is really muffled, I find, at times. There's other issues in this record about that as well, but Baker himself is amazing. Then we have Cole Porter's "You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To." Herbie Mann, I think, really stands out on the alto flute on this track. Then we have "Time in My Hands," which is the final quartet track, but this is the one that has Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones behind Baker. This is easily Evans' best playing on the record. Disappointingly, Chambers is completely muffled, almost inaudible in his solo. The final track is "You and the Night and the Music," and sultry is the word for this, especially when you have Chambers playing arco at points. But just when you think they've laid on extra languor on top of a super languorous record, they pick it up a little bit just to shake it up. When thinking about this record, I kind of have the Bugs Bunny angel on one shoulder and devil on the other. On the one hand, Baker's tone and feel are amazing. It's an all-world lineup. The frontline solos are terrific, particularly Herbie Mann's, but also Pepper Adams. On the other hand, some players are a bit wasted here, and the production is not nearly Keepnews' best work. Burrell and Chambers both sound a bit muffled. In fact, this is the least memorable Paul Chambers appearance on record that I can think of. While there could be no doubt this is a fantastic record to put on at the end of the day when you're feeling like relaxing, pour yourself a glass of something. By the same token, other times you could put it on and feel, I think quite rightly, there's just not a lot of energy coming out of the speakers. A bit of variety might have been nice. I think there are a lot better Chet Baker records out there, and for me, this is 3.5 out of 5 stars.